straight in. All right. So we are we're coming our way to the final panel today. This is going to be a panel on the impact of policy. Larry, come up and take a seat. Of course, the usual NBER rules. I'm going to, given the topic here, specify we not to make policy recommendations, but things that will inform us as to the policy-making environment and assist policymakers, are of course just fine. There have been several issues raised today, and so I'm going to guide the panel through a few of them. I think if one thing that has come out clearly in a number of discussions, both this morning and certainly at lunch, is regarding different predictions of the speed of adoption of AI. And obviously something that hangs in the middle of that, as we saw with discussions of privacy and trade, is what the government response is, either to speed it up or slow it down. So I thought that would be a good place for us to start with the panel in terms of what they think are the first order issues there. And I'm going to start with Austin and we'll go through.
Okay. I think we all understand why the speed of adoption would make a huge difference, whether it's, you know, if 4 million auto drivers, professional drivers are going to lose their jobs, you know, we create 5.5 million jobs a month and we have 5.3 million lost per month. So if those 4 million jobs were lost over a decade, in a way we would barely notice. If it all happened this month, then we would notice quite a lot. I guess I find myself a bit skeptical about the speed of adoption of AI on a broad basis in the economy. And part of it was Larry's point in his question, where he said, well, is it really faster on the jobs front than it has been in the past? But part of it to me is it feels like the economics of that adoption decision is premised on that essentially it's a winner-take-all. These are winner-take-all markets, and all we have to do is get the AI to have a quality superior, and then everyone will switch to that. And I just don't think that's true. I think in a lot of these cases, it's easy to think of these as being heavily segmented markets. I think if you think that, then you got to explain a whole bunch of other things in the economy, like why is so much money still going to actively manage mutual funds and not index funds? And it's so people do things that are not in quality. We would tell them it doesn't make financial sense. And I think the second aspect about that is sort of to our discussions about Facebook, and essentially your AI is only as good as your training sample. If the training sample is not representative of all of society, then it's gonna accentuate this segmentation problem. And I can't remember if it's 2005, whenever the Segway is invented. You remember there was trumpeting when 2000? Okay, trumpeting, including major names. John Doerr said this product is going to be the fastest product to $1 billion of sales that has ever existed. And if you thought about it, why not? I mean, transportation is a huge part of our lives. And the president of the United States falls off of the Segway and breaks his elbow. People look kind of ridiculous driving around in it. It weighs 100 pounds, so if you get to a staircase, you can't go up the stairs. And the Segway is largely a dud. I think AI has a lot of opportunities, but we ought to be a little careful with the Silicon Valley version of this is the most efficient. I don't know that we have car sharing programs. I don't know that we will ever have shoe sharing programs, even though in theory that would be more efficient. Most of the day, most of my shoes are not being used. And so, you know, people should be wearing them. I don't think there are many types of forecasting that haven't actually gotten any better over the last 50 years as our computing power has dramatically improved. Economic forecasts haven't gotten that much better oil futures themselves are not that much better at predicting what oil prices are going to do. And you may have seen the news, Panasonic just invented a fridge that will come to you if you call it. It will bring, it's on wheels and it drives to you to give you your drink. I just think a lot of these things maybe will be segmented, and the islands matter, because if there are a lot of people who either don't think that the AI will choose vegetables better than they will at the grocery store, there will be large numbers of people who don't adopt it, and if they are correlated with a bunch of other economic attributes, which almost certainly they are, then the AI training sample will make the AI really great for people who are very educated or who live in the Bay Area or whatever it may be, but there will be large numbers of people who don't adopt it, so the speed of adoption might not be near as fast as the optimists want.
There are many, many hard policy questions about AI and about technology. This is not one of them. Slowing down technology is a dumb idea. It used to be that we explained in trade classes that trade was kind of like a new technology, and it would obviously be a bad idea to turn off a more productive technology, and therefore protectionism was obviously a bad idea. It's the wrong thing to do. One, it's the wrong thing to do because it reduces our potential to be wealthy, and with more wealth and income, we can achieve more and do more for more people. Two, it's the wrong thing to do because even if we turn off technology, others will not, and our firms and our producers will be poorer as a consequence relative to other nations. Three, it's the wrong thing to do because it's very hard to predict what the consequences will be and what the timing will be. Two examples. There are roughly as many bank tellers in the United States today as there were in 1985, before there were even 5% as many ATMs as there are right now. Who knows? There are a variety of factors that can be adduced to explain that, but it says something. I was on a jet plane that was flown 6,000 miles without its controls being touched by a pilot for takeoff or landing in the year 2000. I have not noticed any reduction in the number of pilots that fly on jet planes. So what the pace of this change will be, very hard to know. Fourth, there's a presumption that we're not starting at the optimum. In anything where the center of it is R&D and the dissemination of ideas, there's a presumption that the market solution is doing too little R&D and speeding things up. So relative to a calculation of the first best, we're already, in all likelihood, slowing it down. And what's happened to public science budgets in the United States has reinforced that effect. So I am completely aware of the 17 theorems Joe Stiglitz will have tomorrow morning about logically possible circumstances under which it could be desirable to slow technical change. I regard those as illustrative of a broad meta proposition that, given any normative proposition, Joe Stiglitz can articulate conditions under which it will be true, not as an illuminating statement about what public policy should be. And I think this is an area where the economics profession would do a substantial disservice if, in its preoccupation with exploring interesting intellectual subtlety, it were to give aid and comfort to the idea that an active policy of slowing technical change would be desirable.
Susan, you've actually thought very much about the instruments that might actually speed up technology adoption, especially with its interaction with competitive forces. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, let me back up a little bit though and address some of the earlier issues as well. So I'm delighted to be here to listen to these guys because I have to talk about this topic a lot, and it's wonderful to hear from people with a variety of knowledge and perspective. I think actually don't hang out with the right people though, because I've never sat on a panel where someone said we should slow down the technical change. So
well, it's like the tax the robots. There are a series of things.
I see. Taxing the. That's a little bit different. I guess that's a slowdown, but it's also a way to think about redistribution. So I think I agree with all of the things that were said, but I think there's a few things that also make me a little bit worried. Like I would say, why could this time be different? And I'd like to be reassured that this time is not. But one thing that's kind of interesting about this technological change is actually the industry structure for how the technology is being adopted. So on the one hand, and as an antitrust economist, we spent a lot of time worrying about the Googles and so on, and how they have proprietary algorithms, and it was very hard to catch up with Google and search and so on. But then on the other hand, we're seeing this competing industry structure transformation from cloud computing, which I think is incredibly productive and underappreciated and undermeasured, but at the same time perhaps exposes us to more risk. So basically, things that in 2008 and 2009, Microsoft spent hundreds of millions of dollars doing the R&D for, and was, other than Google, one of the only companies in the world that could do, like understanding, being able to do all the spell correction, the entity recognition, and the language understanding, and all the things that you can do when you watch people's searches all day. A lot of those things are now offered for very low price or for free through cloud services. So if you want to start a ride-sharing app, you can plug into the Google Maps API. You can use all sorts of services. You can use the machine learning services that were state-of-the-art in Bing a couple of years ago and that were developed through years of learning by doing to perfect. And that's just all available. And so part of why that's all available is that Amazon and Microsoft both think that there's going to be a very concentrated industry structure in cloud computing. Therefore, they're giving away a lot of services to attract people to the cloud. So that's their motivation, but the consequence of that motivation is that it's actually incredibly cheap to be a startup. Even me personally, I have a bunch of data, terabytes of data of mobile browsing, and I've got a budget of a couple $1,000s a year to store it and analyze it, which is just kind of stunning. So, I'm using all these APIs with maps and locations and things like that to analyze it, like basically Bing couldn't do itself 10 years ago. So what does that mean? Well, generally, a lot of firms are getting to the point where they can more nimbly adopt software. They're buying software as a service in the cloud. So, of course, the banks are the slowest of that. A few banks globally are moving to the cloud, but there's a bunch of institutions that are very slow with that, but there's a bunch of them that are quite fast. And then what that means is that once you're buying software as a service and you're not tied in with these huge switching costs with your applications and so on, if it turns out that you can get great speech recognition as a service in the cloud and great AI services, then maybe a lot of smaller scale companies could adopt it, and there might be a stronger correlation in the timing of their adoption than there was in the past. So this is something that concerns me. And then when I look at specific companies that I work with, I've had several companies over the last year and a half come to me and say, Susan, what do I do? I'm going to basically decimate this particular region of my country because I'm going to lay off. I'm the biggest employer in that region, and I've got customer service agents of various sorts, and it is no longer economical today to have them there. I'm just waiting to figure out what to do when I lay them off. And so, I think some of this will happen, and it's going to happen in a bunch of different countries at different times. And then when you think about what am I going to do with the former call center employees, bank tellers, retail operators, and so on, well, there's this sort of correlated shock that's going across all of these industries. So of course, in the long run, it's all good. We have more, we can buy more stuff, we can make more stuff with less inputs, and how could that be bad? But I think in the practical transition, you know, I actually don't quite know what to tell them. I don't know quite what to tell the governments of those countries that are going to go through that. I don't feel like we have good retraining programs. I don't think we really, none of us really know what industries they should be going into exactly. So I feel like we're incredibly unprepared for that, and I think it's actually a failure on all of our parts, both in our roles in government and in our roles in academics, that we don't actually know some of the basic facts about what works or what policies would be effective. So it may or may not be a big deal, but I think there's a risk that a lot of it could come at the same time, and we're not prepared, and that is scary.
So maybe this will give us a little bit of a framework. I think there's 3 questions that are all important and that are worth separate and that are worth keeping clearly separate, because you can, I think you can have all 8, you can have sort of a lot of different possible views. Question 1 is there a big threat that half the population is becoming the economic equivalent of horses because of technology? A horse is just as productive as a horse was 100 years ago, and the economy is able only to support about 1/12 as many horses as it could a century ago. And how serious is the specter of that threat? My instinct, tempered by the empirical observation I discussed with Vinod, despite not having a great rationalization for that, my instinct is that that's a potentially very serious problem. And the fact that the share of men 25 to 54 who aren't working has already tripled is, in the last generation, is evidence that that is a very serious problem. And I think the answers to that have to lie in the retraining area, have to lie in the supporting people who aren't working, have to lie in the recognition that there's probably all kinds of productive work to be done that may or may not have a viable for-profit business model to support it. Tutoring children one-on-one, taking care of the aged, all of that, which I think points to a larger government. But having people do what is the moral equivalent of building pyramids by performing tasks that can be performed automatically by technologies that cost very little seems very unlikely to be the right answer. So I think that is a very serious problem, but probably not a problem that's usefully addressed by antitrust. A second problem is the general availability of technologies that are replacing what clerks do, what retail people do, what wholesale people do, what radiologists do, what nurses, some fraction of what nurses do, is the general pervasiveness of that likely to be associated with large amounts of monopoly power and profits? Maybe, but sure seemed like there were a lot of different companies that Vinod was pointing to. Sure seemed like these algorithms were going to be kind of available off the shelf. Sure seemed like a lot of people were going to be able to enter very easily. So maybe that's going to be associated, maybe though the coming of that is going to be associated with large profits, but doesn't seem obvious to me that the introduction of that technology is going to be associated with large profits. Then I think there's a third question, which is, what about 5 big companies that do a massive amount of information technology related stuff in ways that have networks, in ways that seem to have some economies of scale, and are now the 5 most valuable companies in the world, and whose activities also have broad social consequences. You know, we always on the one hand, you can say we're like a free knowledge society. On the other hand, you have to get a license to start a radio station or a TV station in America. And so whatever the principle is on which you need a license for a TV station would seem to have some similarity with what's involved with social networks. And what should our policies be with respect to those companies, with respect to others who are trying to emerge as those companies? To what extent is it an antitrust issue? To what extent is it a broader regulatory issue? I think that's a huge issue, but one that's somewhat separable from the first two issues. My instincts are my instinct on the first one is big problem, social policy, more government, education. The answer. My instinct on the second one is probably not a big problem. Flourishing ecology of a lot of people trying to disrupt a lot of different industries is probably a good thing. And on the third, my instinct is that there does need to be a lot of thought. I tend to think that, we launched a big antitrust suit against IBM, and by the time we were done not winning our antitrust suit, IBM was looking a lot less potent than it had been. We launched a big antitrust suit against Microsoft. It wasn't looking quite as potent by the time we were done with that. I'm not sure that classic antitrust is the right remedy, but I very much doubt that there is an adequate set of regulatory frameworks in place with respect to the very large technology companies. And I think that's an important issue. I don't think, although there are people in this room who know much more about it than I, that is entirely or even largely an AI issue. That is, on Vinode's account, we don't yet have that much AI, and it's coming. And the largest part of these issues, search we've had now for a bunch of years, and one company's had much of search for a lot of years. Many of the issues posed by Facebook are not centrally tied up with AI. So I think one should not associate the major horsemen of the internet issue in a precise one-to-one way with AI.
Just to follow on, and I think Austin had something to say in that regard. Just in terms of Larry mentioned we want to accelerate, nobody agrees that we should hold back innovation in AI per se. But if we've learned two things from this discussion and other things before, there are possibly two things that are obvious things to promote AI specifically. One would be to pour an awful lot of money into artificial intelligence research, of a moonshot type level. And the second would be to have a set of laws that allowed you to collect massive amounts of data from an entire population and be able to put it to the use in training AIs and doing other things like that. Now, those seem to be the two policies that China has announced, and that they seem to be well aligned with pushing as much AI as possible. And so I wonder in that regard how one would advise the US or other governments around the world to think about whether they want to be promoting AI in that way, absent any other unintended consequences from its adoption, like employment.
I have no idea. I don't have an insight into that. I think, as you describe what is the Chinese government's policy, which I didn't know that it's everyone must provide their genetic data or what they have the ability to. That seems not planetary in a democracy such as ours. I think it strikes me that there's a decent chance that our regulatory, antitrust, and legal policy toward the five horsemen of the internet, or however we want to think about that, will be driven the same way that our antitrust laws were driven in the past. That is, they will be motivated by perceived abuses and obvious examples, and people say, look at what they did. And the Sherman Act and others were largely defined just what is John D. Rockefeller doing? Let us declare that to be illegal. And that's how they came up with a list of behaviors that should be banned. I think that you will see things like, there was a time when the New York Stock Exchange attempted to ban newspapers from reporting their stock prices because they said that's our data and you can't share our data. And we went through legal battles where they defined the law to just forbid them to be able to do that. Likewise, radio stations getting paid by the radio labels to play the music because they knew if they played the music it would lead to more sales. I think there are going to be a series of what I would call abuses, but maybe they're just economic behaviors of the following form that I think will lead to changing the law. Say Alexa, you say, Alexa, I need a new charger for my iPhone. And Alexa says, we have the Amazon Basics charger for $9.99. And you say, well, I'd like an Apple charger. I'm sorry, I don't understand. We have the Amazon Basics charger for $9.99. So the bias, incorporating bias into the general purpose technologies in a way that makes you toll taker on the internet, I think is going to rise in importance. It's obviously in their economic interest to do that. And I think that will lead to some legal addressing that. Sometimes in the wrong way. It can delay the adoption of new technologies as you do that, but at the same time, I don't think in a democracy that they're going to have you send your 23andMe genetic information to the University of Toronto so that they can perfect their machine learning.
Tell that to the citizens of Iceland.
So if a president asked me about the kind of question you asked, I think these would be the answers I would give as best guesses. I'd say probably no need for a massive step up in research spending financed by the federal government on AI. You know, half the most popular course at any great university is already computer science. A little hard to believe that we got a big shortage of talent being drawn into the field. Tons of effort being made by extremely rich companies to do research in this. Not at all clear that the government's going to be good at figuring out what the right research to do is. So I would, should funding be adjusted a bit? Probably. But if you said, should we have the equivalent of the war on cancer to have more, better AI federally funded, I'd say I would be skeptical. Should we have big new databases created by the government? It would make me nervous. I would have a bias towards pressure towards open access with respect to databases that were being created, but I'd be very open to various kinds of regulation around the use of large databases that gave people advantages. And I think I would discourage, maybe I'd be wrong, but I think I would discourage the John D. Rockefeller analogy, because I think I'd say, who exactly is Google ripping off how? They give search to the population for free. Maybe they're ripping off a bunch of companies who use it to advertise in some way, but that doesn't seem like a great populist cause on which to put the masses. So I would be looking more at the privacy and exploitation of data questions would be more my prism than the antitrust prism would be my prism, or at least let me say it differently, than the consumer antitrust prism would be my prism. And I would want to know the answer to the question, which is not obvious to me, which is, if you made it, Vinod had probably 150 companies represented in his slides. Little companies that were starting things, that were going to, do things. If you made a rule that said Amazon and Google couldn't buy those companies, because when they did, it was all anti-competitive for all these reasons, would that make it more attractive or less attractive to start those companies? Maybe it would make it more attractive because you could then grow them and they wouldn't be able to be competed with so easily. Or maybe it would make them less attractive because there'd be less likely to be it'd be harder to have an exit. And I'd want to have some well-informed people with a strong view, with some reason behind their view, before I'd want to go make a lot of policy that was changing things in radical ways.
Actually, I know the answer to that question. It's no, it wouldn't be a good idea to have that ban, and we've done research in that. Jeff Hinton, you were waving. I think you wanted to weigh in on this?
Yes, I wanted to know what data you were using when you said we didn't need more government money to go into training people, because there's a huge gap in Toronto. I don't know the exact numbers, I'm afraid, but there's a gap of about a factor of 10 in the number of educated people in machine learning that the companies want to employ and the number that are going to be available. It's not just a factor of 2, it's a factor of 10.
Well, so the cheap answer would be I have no opinion about Canada because I'm American. But the more substantive answer, I guess I'd give you the economist answer. I guess I'd give you the economist answer, which is, at some wage rate, that's true. And so I imagine, if it's really true that they absolutely need those people, that the wages will be bid up fairly substantially. And I suspect if the wages are bid up fairly substantially, then more people who are talented, if they're able to do it, will move into this field. But the idea that the government, I actually think your rationale is a terrible rationale, to be perfectly honest with you. The idea that Google thinks it has a problem that it can't hire enough high-quality software engineers. It wasn't Google I was talking about, it was a small company. Okay, but fine. The idea that Athey, which is a startup that has $22 million of venture funding for 17% of it, can't get as many software engineers.
Well, they do need to move out of Seattle, for example.
How many? Look, they have to move out of Seattle.
Yeah.
But the idea that
open an office
that everybody's taxpayers' money should be used to support startups, Silicon Valley startups, having to pay lower wages seems to me nuts. So unless there's some bigger externality than companies are experiencing difficulty hiring all the people that they want. The Celtics can't hire as many great basketball players as they'd like, but that's not a reason to have basketball training programs.
All right, so I think Jan, go ahead, then Eric has.
John, you're right on this one. You go ahead. Right. Jeff and I are well-positioned to know that there is a huge amount of investment by industry and AI research and R&D, etc. But it's not sufficient. We get our students from universities. We both keep a foot in university for that reason. And also the style of research that's being done in university is very different. And most of the good ideas in machine learning still come from academia. Even though the fruits of it, the result of it, are developed by our research labs or startups. So I certainly agree that it's not the job of the government to make engineers cheaper for startups. But it's certainly the job of the government, unless I'm mistaken, to do what it can to invest in the economy so the economy grows faster. And if there is a shortage of machine learning graduates by a factor of 10 or 2, it doesn't matter what it is, it's large. We see this everywhere, including in the US. That means the economy is not growing as fast as it could. It's not just expensive.
Why, if there were no government, the government had no subsidy, is the price the fixed factor? Why aren't more students signing up? If there's so much demand for machine learning graduates, it's got to be something that it's really hard to get outstanding people in that area.
But where do those
10% more?
Like, I can't believe I have to defend this. Where do those progress come from? They come from academic research funded by the government.
I think Eric wants to broker this.
Just on this topic, just very briefly, the answer is, as Larry said, it has to be around externalities. And we sometimes think there are externalities in education, and you have to make the argument along those lines, which I think there is a good argument to be made. But my question was different. It's actually another thing that Larry said about privacy, and it seems to me like a really important first issue. For the past couple of years, 100 years, we've had some privacy, but as we heard a little bit from Catherine, but I think even more, you guys probably know that the new Apple has Face ID, so it's recognizes your face to unlock it. And at Baidu, they don't have ID cards. You just walk in, and it recognizes your faces. I'd be surprised if China doesn't have a database of pretty much everyone's faces. The UK has cameras everywhere, which probably shortly, if they don't already, are feeding into that. The IoT. Facebook has more data about all of us and can infer our sexual orientation and political beliefs and a lot of other things, whether or not we disclose them. So I think we're rapidly entering a world, as Scott McNeely said, where there is no privacy unless you move to a cabin in Montana and disconnect. But for practical purposes, it's a very different kind of a world than what we've been used to. And I'd like to have you guys go a little further on what kind of policy should we have. Should we nationalize Facebook's data? They know more than the government does, perhaps, about a lot of things. Should we have some other kinds of rules about how data is used in insurance and health markets? Does it mean we have to change the way that's done? It strikes me as a really quite different kind of a world than what we had just a few years ago. And I'm not sure that economists have grappled with a world with really no prospect of privacy like what we've been used to.
Susan, you thought about that, right?
Yeah, well, so maybe I'll take that in a slightly related direction, which is, what are the policy questions that are going to come up practically about data? Because we're not going to make Google share all of their log data, and we're not going to open up Facebook's
why not?
Data, the log data, because it wouldn't be useful, and it's that's not the way log data really works on the inside of a company. What is useful is there are things that Facebook knows that actually would be really quite useful. So one of Facebook's strategic advantages is that it knows who you are all the time. It knows exactly how many ads you've seen. While if you try to piece that together using, say, Oracle, Blue Sky, cloud type of stuff, you think you're advertising to 10 different people, and actually they're all the same person, and so you can't run experiments, and you can't evaluate your advertising effectiveness, and so on. So what would be really useful to firms would be the ability to have the same kind of identity understanding that Facebook has, but Facebook won't share it, and of course, half the room would be up in arms if we did that. It would be much more efficient for publishers. We would have a happier news industry and more effective advertising, but it would all be all the much less private, because I just said what you really need is to link everybody together. But that is a piece of data that would actually be valuable and have market value and so on. But just kind of trying to backward engineer what's going on inside of Facebook is really not very easy. But I think there is actually something coming where if we changed what we do now, we could actually have these kinds of big databases in a way that would have big social consequences. So I'll put out to you to all think about this. So I'm obsessed with transportation. I'm obsessed with transportation because I think that if we automate everything faster than we fix our transportation infrastructure, then a lot of displaced people who could otherwise come to cities and provide services to rich people in cities will not be able to do so effectively because they can't. The cost of living is too high. If we reduce the transportation costs, you increase the land area at an R-squared rate. Therefore, you reduce the cost of land, which is one of the biggest pieces of the cost of living for people trying to provide services to people in cities. So if we can fix the transportation infrastructure faster than we displace workers, then there'd be a natural transition path for a lot of people to basically, a city could basically get much bigger and much cheaper. So I'm interested in transportation. What is that industry going to look like? Well, one question is like, who owns the data when all these cars are driving around? If it evolves the way kind of search and Facebook evolved, then all the log data for each company will be proprietary. There won't really be any way to sort of come back and share it. But if you imagine, just like we do with electronic medical records or something else, if we kind of put some data structures on it early on and got some of that data kind of to be publicly shared, that could actually change the shape of the industry, and it could also change the shape of the infrastructure and so on. So I guess the bigger picture question that I think everybody should think about is, how are we going to regulate cars, transportation, drones, all the imagery, all the video, all of the accident events? Is that, I mean, you can tell everybody to share it later, but if the data is not compatible and not meaningful, you won't be able to do anything with it. So we'll actually have to think about that architecture relatively early. And I think it will matter in terms of the speed of the innovation, the entry, the competitive structure, and so on.
Joel
I'd
had
say-
okay, yes, you.
I'd say two things.
So I want to just briefly refer to Austin and Larry's point about that it would be nuts, to use your term, Larry, to advocate slowdown of technological change. And anybody who knows my work realizes that I'm a techno-optimist, and I've written books about how great technological change has been for mankind. But I want to play devil's advocate just for a second, Larry, to think about something. There's a book by a man called Edward Tenner called When Technology Bites Back, in which he goes over a large number of cases in which unanticipated consequences of technology actually have had very serious effects. And there are a few examples that he brings in which one could actually make a serious argument that the net social benefits of a particular invention have been negative. One example that I think we're all familiar with is the addition of lead compounds to gasoline introduced by General Motors in 1924, or the invention of chlorofluorocarbons for spray cans, by the way, same inventor, by the way, a man called Thomas Midgley. Long story. But listening to Vinod this afternoon, you know, if somebody who's really worried about the bite-back effects of technology were listening to him, I mean, the examples could easily multiply. And the reason I think we should take this seriously, because there are a lot of very smart, informed, intelligent people who are scared to death by AI. We haven't raised that issue yet in this conference, but I wonder, you know, if there is really completely no basis for the concerns of people like Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, Nick Bostrom. I mean, there's a whole people writing against AI as an existential threat. And what they must be worried about is exactly the kind of bite-back effects that Tenner is worried about. Now, I don't know what these bite-back effects could be. I'd like the panel to think about, because it's not just unreasonable that these really bright people fail to see what you see.
We shouldn't, I think we could agree, we the economists, that we should not primarily think of the bite-back effects as being about jobs. Okay, and that's what mostly when people say about, oh, this is a disaster because these guys are going to lose their jobs.
But that's not what they're worried about.
Joel,
if the world were going to end, then after the fact we could agree that was a bad technology.
Joel,
if we could have banned it, we should have, because.
So I'd say three things. One, so I've read Tenner's book, so I've thought about what you said. I don't think the lead gasoline or the chlorofluorocarbons are such a great example. Everybody would agree that environmental bads that are recognized as environmental bads, it's well within the government's right to mandate. So I don't think that you'd think about regulating that as part of a general effort to slow down technical change. The problem is at the time those were invented, nobody knew they were harmful. So I think the question then would be, do you think that we're so bad at figuring stuff out that we're better off just slowing technical change down in general? And I think the answer to that is no. And so, I mean, should we have figured out quicker that CFCs were bad? Yes. But, you know, that's the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is I've been there a fair amount. It is whatever this group thinks that if we were the Council for Regulating Technology, we could achieve in technological regulation, I promise you that any government will not, I don't think this group could do so great, and any government constituted with the mission cannot do a tenth as well. So the problem with all Joe Stiglitz's things is they're all right logically. The problem is that they assume a degree of knowledge, a degree of ability to insulate from interest, and an ability to act in a streamlined way that is not realistic, and that one has to, that economics tends to talk about the first best versus the second best, and one of the first things you learn in government is that it's about the fifth best versus the sixth best, and the government's ability to figure it all out right, it seems to me, is quite limited. So I also know something about the sort of hawking, you know, we'll get to the singularity and it'll be evil stuff. And I sort of relate to that as a concern. I kind of think the answer to that, at least in the world we live in for the United States, is it's like saying we shouldn't do research on fusion of any kind because it'll lead to really bad weapons. And there are a lot of countries, and if we don't do this research, that doesn't mean this research is not going to get done. And having others who are potential adversaries do it and us not do it because we've decided it's bad seems kind of League of Nations-y. And so I guess I think as a practical policy, that doesn't seem to me to be realistic. And so I think you have to approach these things with a kind of bias. That doesn't mean there aren't some areas, you know, there to take a field I know a little bit about. There was a quite systematic and thoughtful effort years ago around the issue of recombinant DNA. It was a genetic technology, and maybe if you did it wrong, it could accidentally produce killer bugs. And there was a set of thoughtful conversations between the government and the relevant biology community around the rules that would govern experimentation in those areas. And I could imagine that there was some aspect of AI technology where it would be sensible to proceed in that way. But I think it's different, and I may have spoken in an effort to be vivid, which I think I did succeed in. I may have spoken with insufficient care. I think a more careful statement would be generic slowing down is misguided, that there should be a very strong presumption against resisting what people think of as inquiry, but with sufficient grounds that it'll damage the environment or have some set of external consequences. Clearly, in those cases, you would want to have policy.
Susan's got it.
Just a few comments on that. One thing that I think is legitimate to be afraid of is the people using the AI and not quite figuring it all out. So just as a simple example, like if you're stuck in traffic, sometimes Google Maps will suddenly tell you to turn left, but then like everybody turns left and there's a backup getting back into your main road. And so that's like a simple example of feedback effects. Inside the search engine, we made lots of mistakes. We tested something on 5% of traffic. We shipped it to 100% of traffic. Like all ads stopped. We lost millions of dollars, you know. And so over time, the people in those complex systems learned how to manage them and learned the feedback effects, and you get these sort of rules of thumb of why, you know, small experiments don't extend, and when there are budget constraints involved, and when you're really changing the slate of ads that are being shown, then, you know, you change your training data and these things happen. Or so we gained over a period of years the collective wisdom about mistakes, but those were totally not obvious to the people at the beginning. In some cases, people like me warned and weren't listened to. And so I just think that, you know, there's really nothing about the science of basic machine learning and simple AI that trains you to think about those feedback effects. The idea that the AIs themselves will learn their objective function completely doesn't work if you're thinking about, you know, some of these more complicated equilibrium feedback effects. So I think I think it is probability one that we will make some sorts of fairly major mistakes when all the cars are out there driving with each other and so on. I mean, I hope that we'll figure it out, but these are really hard problems.
And that's why having people like you working in this area, you're a national treasure. But that is not...
We don't slow it down. The conclusion of that is not to slow it down.
It's not a rationale, but I was concerned something different.
Yep.
It's not... It is not a compelling rationale for the government to be involved.
And the government can't really fix that either.
I mean, just all you enthusiasts for the government, I want you to just think about the fact that because people understood, and they'd understood for a long time, that big financial institutions were dangerous. In 2008, on any given random Tuesday, the government was so committed to keeping Citigroup and JP Morgan and whatnot safe that on every random Tuesday, there were 500 government employees spending all day at Citigroup engaged in the process of keeping Citigroup safe. And they didn't. And so the idea that if the government recognizes the danger and establishes rules and regulates extensively, the dangers will be protected against is one that we should have some caution. Now, some of you will say, well, that's because Citigroup co-opted the government. And you can argue about the extent to which that is or is not true, but maybe big IT companies will co-opt the government too. So it's not an answer to say, so I just think we need skepticism about what the government's able to do.
But the government will regulate transportation. I mean, they will. So we hope they'll do it.
Can I just with one final question, and Manuel I think wants to come in, but let me just before Jason Furman unfortunately couldn't be here. One of his last acts, well, not quite, because one of his last acts was to release 4 reports on the effects of AI. 4 reports were released, and of course, no one except for Jay Agrawal read them on that. And I'm just wondering, and Manuel maybe can step in and actually answer this as our dim-witted politician in the room. What did he know that caused him to feel that he had to release the 4 reports on AI and rush that out? Why did that, in other words, signaling this should have been a priority and it's a shame it won't be? What did he know? Because as far as I can see, we've talked about the US government not spending any government money on AI.
This is like a conspiracy that he knew Donald Trump was going to win.
No, I think the US government may well be spending more on AI than anyone else. It's just not open. I'm just wondering, in that environment, is there something that there was a broader understanding of this going on?
No, I can speak in an informed way about this. Jason was a responsible chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. The job of the Council of Economic Advisors is to think about economic issues of the future a bit ahead of the curve. This was such an issue, and so a variety of staff at the CEA worked hard thinking about it. It was important that their work have visibility. Jason was going to lose the ability to give the work visibility and to release it when the administration went out of office. And so as a final part of doing the job of the Council of Economic Advisors responsibly and having a legacy, all that they had learned in their work was shared. I don't think there was any deeper sense of either alarm or optimism. I think the precise timing is best understood in terms of our electoral rhythms.
But I think what's important there is to say that there will be things coming. There will be, my point on transportation is there will be policy decisions. Like we are going to have to decide whether to build highways and let cars go right next to each other, and we're going to have to think about insurance. There's so many policy decisions we're going to have to make just in that one area. And so it's important to have a whole community of informed people who can guide against bad regulation.
Yeah, well, a few comments actually. First of all, I share completely Larry's skepticism about government being able to do good. Perhaps, once you are there, you realize that. But at the same time, I want to comment on that. One is that we haven't talked in this room, and we should, about deploying AI for the benefit of governing. We have talked about healthcare and this and that and transportation and whatnot, but the government is an important sector in the economy, the public sector. And there are many, many functions of government that are really backwards. I mean, that they need innovation, and they're clamoring for it. And we should pay attention to that because it can make a big difference. I've been advocating that in a certain context, but I won't get into that now. So let's not oversee that important aspect, I think. That's one point. The second point, I want to go back to the comment about the shortage of AI scientists and programmers and whatnot, and whether the government should or can do something about it. Well, let me very briefly relate you to what's happening in Israel. In Israel, there's a huge demand for that kind of people, and there are rigidities in the university system. I headed the university system in Israel, okay? And, university cannot pay the professors in computer sciences enough to keep them from the competition from industry. And so, there is nobody to teach. I'm exaggerating, there are not enough faculty to teach. Moreover, those that stay at the university, their incentives is not to teach or to train, is to, come here and whatever, promote their own research. So this is institutional rigidities don't square up with the needs of the economy. So there is room for clever policies to overcome those rigidities. And another rigidity is that the flow between universities and industry that is more necessary than ever now. Okay, we see a few cases here, but you are the exceptions. I keep hearing that all the time. Okay, there is a need for a much more flexible system. The tenure system of universities with their incentives that come attached to that, the way that universities are managed, okay, and so forth, are not really well adjusted to the realities of a reality where the boundaries between research being done here and there are completely blurred, okay? So there is a lot to do in that. There is a lot to do in terms of bringing AI, okay, into the government, with all the skepticism in terms of more general policies that I completely agree with you, Larry.
Cities have been very innovative in terms of adopting the new technology, and Ed Glazer and Mike Luca have a nice recent survey paper about that if you're interested.
I'm a torn on that one because on one hand, I could see the government using AI to figure out whose water meters were going to go out before they went out and getting out to fee and optimizing the garbage. But I could equally see the voter suppression, I shouldn't call it vote, the voter, what did they call it? Voter integrity, the Voter Integrity Commission using AI to figure out who are their political enemies and thereby going out and trying to get them delisted and deregistered to vote. So people are going to use whatever technologies we have, sometimes for good, sometimes for partisans, sometimes to show off to their neighbors. And I don't think we should think that the better AI gets, we're going to abolish those aspects of the human personality for sure.
Let me say three things. One, on government using the technology, I am inclined to agree with you pretty strongly. But the people really like discretion. Look, sentencing guidelines are a really good idea. They make things fairer. It's pretty obvious that they make things fairer and less arbitrary. You could probably make them even fairer if you had like a computer algorithm that would take all the facts of the situation and judge an appropriate sentence. But already, discretion of judges with sentencing guidelines, people are upset. I'm sure the rules about which medical care reimbursements would be approved and which would not be approved could be made substantially better with the use of AI. But the already relatively fluid regulations with human discretion are known throughout America as death panels and are rejected. So I am in sympathy with what you're saying pretty totally, but the politics would become, which are already difficult in that direction, would become much worse.
But at the local level, these have been implemented in
depends
many cities.
Depends on what
Some
the
government functions that are prediction-based, and AI would be great for them. There are many functions
Auditing
about
tax
government
returns
that are not really fundamentally about prediction. They're about value judgments, and it's not going to help us with that.
On university rigidities, I'm glad you gave me a chance to say that. Look, one of the many positions I took during my time as president of Harvard that wasn't so popular with large parts of the Harvard faculty, but where I guess I think right now still think I was probably right, was I used to say that when a professor had a really good idea that drew on his research and could be the basis for a commercial product that was sold, Stanford thought it was a fantastic thing, and Harvard thought it was a real risk of a conflict of interest. And the fact that Stanford had its view and Harvard had its view had a lot to do with why Silicon Valley, which Boston thought would happen around Route 128, in fact happened 3,000 miles away, and that it was really imperative for Harvard to change that. So on a whole set of things about rigidities of universities, I would completely agree with you. I would just be nervous. My point was really just about spending the money on the training of people who were going to get high salaries paid by people who were very wealthy, that stepping up the government financial commitment to that training seemed to me to be a problematic policy.
All right, I know there were plenty of questions out there. That's a hallmark of a great panel. we're actually over time, so I want to thank the panelists for their thoughts. Thank you.